Be honest, when was the last time Vans actually felt cool to you? Not familiar, not nostalgic, not something you saw on a sale rack or remembered from school, but genuinely cool, in that effortless way Vans used to be. Because for a long time, Vans didn't need to explain itself. The shoes already said everything: the checkerboard slip-ons, the worn-out Old Skools, the scuffed canvas, the skate parks, the punk shows, the warped tour crowd. It was never about looking polished. It was about looking like you belonged to something just slightly outside the mainstream. That was the magic of Vans. But somewhere along the way, the brand became too familiar. The classics stayed, but the energy around them started to fade. Sales dropped, stores closed, and the outsider brand suddenly looked like it was trying to remember what made it outsider in the first place. So what happened? How did Vans lose its edge? And can it ever become off the wall again? The story of Vans doesn't begin in a boardroom or with a marketing team trying to invent a youth movement. It begins in Anaheim, California in 1966, with a small family business making shoes directly for the people walking through the door. And that detail matters, because Vans was built almost completely upside down from the way fashion brands usually work. It wasn't launched as an image first, product second. It didn't arrive with celebrity campaigns or some carefully packaged idea of cool. Paul Van Doren, his brother Jim, and their partners opened the Van Doren Rubber Company with a much simpler idea: make canvas shoes, sell them directly to customers, and skip the middleman. At the time, that wasn't a lifestyle strategy. It was just practical. The first shoe, later known as the Authentic, was simple almost to the point of being ordinary. Canvas upper, rubber sole, clean shape. Nothing about it screamed fashion. But the way it was made gave it something that mattered more than polish: function. The rubber sole had grip, the construction could handle real wear, and the shoe was affordable enough that people didn't have to treat it like something precious. And that is where Vans started to become Vans. Because in Southern California, skateboarders found the shoes before the fashion world did. They weren't looking for a trend. They were looking for something that worked. Something that could stick to a board, survive concrete, and still feel like it belonged to them. And Vans, almost accidentally, became the answer. That is the kind of brand origin you can't really manufacture later. It wasn't a logo-chasing culture. It was culture choosing a shoe because it made sense. The scuffed canvas, the sticky sole, the slightly imperfect look, all of it became part of the appeal. Vans didn't need to look expensive. They looked better when they looked lived in. And if you've ever owned a pair, you probably know exactly what that means. They could fit into a skate park, a school hallway, a concert, or just the kind of outfit that wasn't trying too hard. That early connection gave Vans something most brands spend decades trying to create: credibility. Not the polished kind, not the luxury kind, but the kind that comes from being adopted by people who actually use the product. Vans became cool because it had a purpose before it had a mythology. And for a long time, that made the brand feel almost untouchable. Not because it was perfect, but because it belonged to the people wearing it. And once that happened, Vans had something most brands can only dream of: a real culture around the product. The question was how far that culture could travel before it started to change. What made Vans unusual was that it didn't stay inside one scene for very long. It started with skateboarding, but the people wearing Vans were never only skaters. They were also surfers, BMX riders, musicians, teenagers hanging around local shows, and kids building an identity out of whatever culture felt closest to them. That is where the brand started to spread. Not through one clean marketing lane, but through overlapping worlds that all shared the same energy: casual, rebellious, and slightly outside the mainstream. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Vans had created the visual language that would define it for decades. The era, the old school, the slip-on, and the skate-high. Each gave the brand a different entry point into youth culture. The old school had the side stripe. The slip-on had the checkerboard pattern. The skate-high looked more protective, more connected to actual skateboarding. These were not just product updates anymore. They were symbols people could recognize instantly. And then came the moment that pushed Vans beyond its original scene. In 1982, the checkerboard slip-on appeared in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, worn by Sean Penn's character, Jeff Spicoli. It was funny, careless, very California, and suddenly, Vans had a pop culture image attached to it. You didn't need to know every detail of skate culture to understand the attitude. The shoe did that work on its own. That is when Vans started becoming something bigger than a skate brand. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the company leaned deeper into the culture around the shoe. Skate parks, BMX, surf events, music, and eventually the Warped Tour all helped turn Vans into a full youth culture ecosystem. And this is where the brand became really powerful, because it was no longer just selling a product. It was surrounding itself with the people, places, and sounds that made the product feel alive. The Warped Tour especially gave Vans a kind of emotional ownership over an entire generation. If you were into punk, emo, pop-punk, skate culture, or anything adjacent to that world, Vans was just there. On stage, in the crowd, in the parking lot, in the merch lines. It became part of the scenery of being young and slightly alternative. And that mattered, because most brands have to buy cultural relevance from the outside. Vans had built a world where relevance kept coming back to it. The shoes were simple enough to move across scenes, but recognizable enough to carry meaning wherever they went. For a long time, that balance worked beautifully. Vans could be mainstream without feeling completely absorbed by the mainstream. It could be worn by millions and still carry a trace of the subcultures that made it famous. It had even survived a Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1984, the result of expanding too fast into products that had nothing to do with skate, surf, or the people who built it, and clawed its way back by doing less, not more. But that kind of balance is fragile, because once a brand becomes a uniform, it faces a different problem. The thing that makes it instantly recognizable can also become the thing that makes it too familiar. And for Vans, that tension would slowly become harder to ignore. That is where Vans started to face the problem every cultural brand eventually has to deal with. The more recognizable it became, the harder it was to keep that original feeling intact. Because Vans had never been built like a trend brand. It had been built from use, from scenes, from people who wore the shoes because they made sense in their world. But once that world became profitable, the brand had to do something much more complicated, turn subculture into a business without making it feel like a costume. For a long time, Vans managed that balance better than most. Even after VF Corporation acquired the brand in 2004, Vans still had the kind of cultural credibility that many larger companies would have struggled to preserve. The classics kept selling. The checkerboard remained instantly recognizable. The Old Skool became one of those rare sneakers that could move between skate parks, fashion editorials, music, videos, and everyday wardrobes without needing much explanation. But that success also created a trap. Because when a brand has a few icons that work, the temptation is obvious. Keep pushing them. More colors, more collaborations, more versions of the same familiar shapes. And at first, it makes sense. Consumers know them. Retailers understand them. The brand identity stays clear. But over time, the thing that once felt timeless can start to feel predictable. And for Vans, that became the bigger issue. The brand didn't suddenly become irrelevant. People still knew it. People still recognized it. But recognition is not the same as desire. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, fashion was moving in different directions. Chunkier sneakers were everywhere. Running silhouettes were becoming fashion statements. New Balance, Hoka, On, and other comfort-driven brands were taking up more space in people's wardrobes. Gorpcore and technical footwear were changing what cool looked like. And Vans, for all its history, started to feel slightly stuck. Even inside the company, the problem was becoming harder to deny. Vans' own leadership admitted that the brand had lost part of its rebelliousness, that it had become watered down. And for a brand like Vans, that is a brutal thing to admit, because rebellion was never just decoration. It was the whole reason people believed in it. And maybe you felt that shift too. Vans never fully disappeared from stores, closets, or street style. But when was the last time the brand actually felt ahead of culture? There were also deeper frustrations from loyal customers. Some began saying the shoes didn't feel as durable as they used to, that soles wore down faster, or that the product simply didn't hold up the same way. And whether every complaint tells the full story or not, perception matters. For a brand built on grip, wear, and trust, even the idea that the product had weakened cut straight into the identity. That is what made Vans' decline more painful than a normal sales slowdown. It wasn't just that the numbers were starting to move in the wrong direction. It was that the brand had begun to feel less connected to the world that made it powerful in the first place. Vans had not lost its name. It had started losing its edge. And eventually, culture stopped being the only warning sign. Because maybe that is the strange thing about Vans. You could still recognize it instantly, still understand what it was supposed to stand for, and yet feel no real urgency to buy another pair. The logo still meant something, but it no longer seemed to create the same pull. In VF Corp's fourth quarter of fiscal 2025, Vans revenue dropped 22% year over year. Then, in the first quarter of fiscal 2026, it fell another 14%. By the second quarter, the decline had improved to 9%, but that was still a decline. What made it stand out even more was what was happening around it. Inside VF Corp's portfolio, other brands were performing better. The North Face and Timberland were showing growth in moments where Vans was still dragging behind. So Vans was no longer just a brand with a relevance problem. It was becoming the difficult part of a much larger company's turnaround story. And that forced action. Under CEO Bracken Darrell, VF Corp began pushing its wider reinvent plan, and Vans became one of the most important brands to fix. The company closed around 140 of its least profitable stores over 2 years, roughly 20% of its global retail footprint. And for a brand that once grew through being everywhere culture was happening, that is a strange place to be. Vans was not bankrupt. It was not finished. But it had become something almost more uncomfortable. A famous brand trying to prove that fame still meant something. It was no longer just trying to sell more shoes. It was trying to convince people that the shoes still mattered. So now we're in 2026, and if you've followed this story so far, the obvious question is, what does Vans do now? Because you can close stores, you can cut costs, you can clean up distribution, but none of that answers the bigger problem. How do you make people want Vans again? That is where the current reset becomes interesting. Under Sun Chu, Vans is trying to widen how people see the brand, not abandoning skate, but no longer letting Vans feel trapped inside one narrow version of it. The goal is to make Vans feel more dimensional again. Footwear, apparel, women's, music, art, fashion, and the creative world that once made the brand feel alive. You can see that in the recent moves. SZA becoming Vans' artistic director is not just a celebrity campaign. She is expected to help reimagine campaigns and co-create product collections, giving the brand a new cultural voice. The renewed off-the-wall campaign around the authentic does something similar. It goes back to the original shoe, but places it next to artists like SZA, Hayley Williams, and Travis Barker, almost like Vans is trying to prove that the simplest shoe in its archive can still say something in 2026. Then there is the premium OTW line, the Valentino collaboration, and the return of Warped Tour. One side pushes Vans into fashion, the other pulls it back toward music and youth culture. And that is the difficult balance. Vans does not need to become unrecognizable. It needs to make its old identity feel current again, because Off the Wall was never just a slogan. It was a feeling. And if Vans wants a real comeback, that is what it has to get back. So I'm curious, do you think Vans can become cool again, or has the brand already lost the edge that made it special? Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.